going to start off with a quick announcement, and then we will turn it over to Matt and Mike to tell us all about pest and disease issues of cucurbits. And this is the cucumber, melon, squash family. So this is so many of our popular summer crops. And those are some more of the crops I've been moving in and out while we wait for frost-free weather to finally get here. So it'll be great to learn about those today. Then Matt and Mike will share with us some Be on the Lookout. So these are insects and diseases that will be showing up in our gardens and landscapes in the next few weeks. So a little bit of a heads up to look out for things that might be out there. Caroline will finish us out with our resource spotlight. So this is a relatively new feature where we share a resource that will help us in our extension education and our own gardening. And we'll finish up with some Extension Master Gardener program announcements. Before we jump into it this morning, I wanted to give a big shout out to our Master Gardener volunteers in Durham County. They had 2 projects that placed in the International Master Gardener Search for Excellence Awards program. So congratulations for that. And the volunteers that were involved in those projects told us about them a few weeks ago in our first Learn, Grow, Share Showcase webinar. So a big thanks to Araya April and Melinda Heigl, who talked about their project to extend connection and education through social media and blog outreach, and also to Deborah Pilkington and Peter Gilmore, who told us about their Cocoa Cinnamon Container Garden project, which involved many more volunteers, but these are just the volunteers that presented. If you missed that, the recording's available on the Extension Master Gardener intranet, and well worth watching. I also want to say many thanks to Sally Kuhn, who is a Master Gardener volunteer in Mecklenburg County that helped facilitate the webinar and will be helping support this webinar series as we hold more in the future. So we're very much looking forward to that. And we want you to help us plan those webinars. We want to know what types of things you would like to learn about and hear about from other Master Gardener volunteers across the state, and any projects that are going on in your county, successful projects, or even just little things you've done that have made a positive difference either in the outreach that you're doing for education to the public or for the program itself, the Extension Master Gardener program in your county. We have a survey. The link is posted again on the EMG intranet. This Go link will take you there where you can find it. And we'd love to hear from you so that we can plan those future webinars and feature you and the projects that are making a difference in your county. And with that, one more hearty welcome to everybody this morning, and I will turn it over to Matt Bertone and Mike Munster with the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic at NC State. Good morning, Matt and Mike. Really looking forward to this.
Good morning, Caroline.
Good
morning, everyone out there.
Good morning.
Looking forward to this dive into cucurbit pests and diseases.
Well, and first we want to take a quick dive into the cucurbits themselves. So let me go ahead and get a screen up and running. One thing you're talking about the weather, I think one of the other headlines around here is going to be the rain. If I'm not mistaken, it'll only take us about 0.3 of an inch, and we will have the wettest April on record in Raleigh, with the previous record being set only in 2019. So that's going to be something to watch as well. All right. Make sure that I share the right screen here. Well, when we talk about cucurbits, first of all, we're talking about a family. And the 3 most important genera really that we see in that family in North Carolina and in the clinic are Cucurbita, Citrullus, and Cucumis. In the genus Cucurbita, we have mostly what we're seeing is Cucurbita pepo. I pronounce it pepo, but that would be a lot of your squashes and pumpkins in there. Whereas Cucurbita maxima, there's I think some winter squash in there and some kinds of pumpkins, and Moschata, you've got the butternut squash. Whereas the Cucurbita argyrosperma, that one is, I know it as PPN, but if you look on the handbook, the toolbox, you'll see that it's called Cushaw or Cushaw squash. And that one has some really large silvery seeds, thus the name argyrosperma. It also has the advantage of not being affected by the squash vine borer, something that Matt will be talking about. The genus Cucumis, so Cucumis sativus, that's our cucumbers, and Cucumis mellow would be the melons, the honeydews, the cantaloupes, and so forth. And Citrullus lanatus is, of course, our watermelon. If we look at a few of the others, so if I went back and looked at some of the data going back to 2008, and almost all the cucurbits that we had coming into the clinic were in these three genera. The others worth mentioning, I think, though, would be Satium, which is the chayote, for those of you who have ever cooked with that. It's an interesting cucurbit, looks kind of like a pear, and it has one large seed in the middle. Lagenaria, which is your bottle gourd, and the loofah. So we did have one loofah sample that came into the clinic in that period of time, about the last 15 years, but everything else was either the Cucurbitaceae, Citrullus, or Cucumis. All right. I want to also mention this. So if you were fortunate enough to have attended the state fair this past October, you may have seen in the vegetable displays this exhibition, fruits of what was labeled there as a cross-pollinated pumpkin watermelon. And let me just kind of toss it out to the group here. What two problems do you see with that hypothesis? Take a look at the chat here. Guess no one wants to venture one. Okay, so pumpkin and watermelon are from different genera. And in fact, if you look at the cucurbit breeding program page from NC State, they have a chart of which cucurbits can cross with one another. And in the intersection between pumpkins and watermelons, you notice that's a minus sign that they do not cross. So that's one problem. The other problem is when we talk about two plants crossing one another, usually the difference, the hybrid, is going to show up in the progeny. So the seeds you would plant would be the ones who would have the unusual fruit, not the fruit that's from the mother plant. So yeah, there were two problems with this hypothesis, which leads us then to say, okay, what was going on there? And hopefully we'll have at least a tentative answer at the end of the piece that I'll be giving here. All right. We do have to mention too the enormous versatility of cucurbits for our use. In fact, if you look at the cucurbit page, it mentions it as being one of the top 5 families of angiosperms as far as crops go. So we have some that we eat the fruit raw. So I had some cucumbers on my wrap yesterday. So that was an example. Eating others, we eat the fruit cooked, sometimes pickled. So if you have pickles on your hamburger, or if like me, you're a big fan of watermelon rind pickles. The flowers of squash are edible. You can see there a cluster of them, the male flowers, and it's a traditional Mexican dish to make quesadillas with those. And some have edible seeds, as you probably are aware, and even some are used as utensils. So the bottle gourd there on the right, that one is that's the lagenaria that was mentioned in that first slide I had, or second. That one you may have seen used for birdhouses, but also that is a traditional way of carrying water. I believe that my father-in-law, may rest in peace, and the other men in his town would carry water with them in the gourd like this. Fiber, of course, famously the loofah or loofah, and for decorations, as we know, all around Halloween. So the jacks of all trades there at the top was a little bit of a pun. Unfortunately, though, this very useful family gets a lot of different diseases. And I'm even on this chart not showing the ones that only showed up once or not at all in our home gardens in the clinic database for the last 15 years. So there are a lot that I won't even mention because even though they can be problems in commercial production, we don't really see them in the home gardens. But even with this short list, it's still a pretty long list, so I won't talk about all of these, but I do want to emphasize some points here about the relative susceptibilities of the different cucurbits. So with downy mildew, the far and away that we see the most on is cucumber. And secondly would be on the squash or pumpkin. Melons do get it, and I'll mention that a little bit when we get to that. Whereas with the powdery mildew, as the squash or pumpkin, really pumpkins are a type of squash, it's the powdery mildew that hits those the hardest, although it can occur on others as well. Anthracnose can occur on multiple, at least we've seen it in home samples on cucumbers, melons, and on watermelon. The anthracnose, I'm sorry, the gummy stem blight would be more of a watermelon problem. There are a couple of fusarium diseases, the crown rot and the wilt. Those are different sorts of animals, the wilt being a vascular wilt where the fungus is actually infecting the xylem. Phytophthora diseases, I mentioned a little bit briefly about those. Pythium as well, it's related to Phytophthora, another water mold, an oomycete. Bacterial leaf spot, and then rounded out with root knot nematodes and quick look at some virus diseases. So I'll actually even pare this list down further to something like this list for purposes of the program today. And we'll jump right in with the worst of them, which is the downy mildew. So this is caused by an oomycete pathogen. So you could call it a fungus-like organism. Although I would say that just with dealing with home gardeners, it's probably fair to call it a fungus. Really, ecologically, it behaves as a fungus. And it turns out that there are two different subgroups within this species. They're called clade 1 and clade 2. Clade 1 has a tendency to go more to the watermelons and the pumpkins and squash, whereas clade 2 is more on the cucumbers and the melons. So there's some pathogenic specialization, we call it, within the species. This is a foliar disease only. It's very destructive on that foliage, and it needs moisture. So it has to have that free water to be able to infect, but it doesn't need a very long period of time to have the water on the leaf in order for infection to occur. The spread is by airborne sporangia, so effectively spores, and very importantly, this is a warm weather pathogen that does not overwinter here in North Carolina. So it overwinters farther south in places like Florida, and then brings up comes up to North Carolina on air currents, usually arriving somewhere in, I would say probably an average would be early June. Unfortunately, it can also come in on transplants, so you have to be very careful about the transplants you buy to not that they're not infected already with downy mildew. So the symptoms, as you can see here, it's most dramatic on cucumber because of the bright yellow angular spots visible on the upper surface of the leaf. And if you flip that over and the conditions have been moist enough, you'll see just a hint of that sporulation, the kind of little bit of a bluish grayish coloration to the undersides of those spots that if we looked at it under a hand lens or a microscope, we could confirm the presence of that downy mildew pathogen. This is where the spores are being produced that will then blow around and spread the pathogen. With time, of course, these spots will die and you can get a lot of leaf loss. You're losing your photosynthetic capability, and also you're leaving the fruits. If you've already have fruits developing, they're being exposed to the sunlight, and you get problems for that reason. On pumpkin and cantaloupe, it's a little bit different. Here's an example of downy mildew on pumpkin there. In this particular photograph, they're smaller spots, but still angular. But on cantaloupe, the spots are a little bit more diffuse, or can be. So it's not quite as easy a field diagnosis in that particular group of cucurbits. So what can you do? For managing CDM here, cucurbit downy mildew, managing that in the home garden. Well, as I mentioned, make sure that your transplants are clean. That will be a first step for not only downy mildew, but a number of other diseases as well. Planting early, because again, it's not in North Carolina over the winter, but when it arrives, you want to have your plants as far along as possible. Avoid overhead and late day watering so that we're not extending that leaf wetness period or encouraging that leaf wetness period that the fungus needs or the organism needs. Unfortunately, fungicides, the ones available at least to homeowners, are going to be limited in their effectiveness. You would have to also be applying on a pretty frequent schedule, up to once a week even. Chlorothalonil is one that can be used and is available to homeowners. If you're organic, but your only option is copper, but really don't expect too much result from that. And really, they're not, neither one is going to be a cure-all. Harvesting early if you're getting leaf loss and danger of sunburn on the fruits, and keep an eye out. I haven't checked the resources lately to see where we stand as far as having some resistant varieties available to the homeowners. Let's see. Oh, I did check that. No, that's been quite a while ago. That Burpee had 1 melon and 2 cucumber varieties, and Park had 1 cucumber line that they said were resistant to this. Or another option, of course, would be to move to a more arid part of the country, but most folks are probably going to want to stay around here and not leave just because of cucumber downy mildew. So switching to now the powdery mildew. First, let's do a little poll. I lost my here we go. Let's see. Launch a poll here. So what do you think? When you're looking for signs of powdery mildew, remember when signs, we refer to the actual fungus itself that you're seeing. So that sporulation in the downy mildew, and in the case of powdery mildew, would be what we call the mycelium, the conidiaphores, the conidia. Where is that sign going to be in the case of powdery mildew? The undersides, upper sides, both sides of the leaves, or neither? So give folks a quick moment to enter. See, we've got 113 people on, and about 2/3 have replied. Give folks just one other moment here before we end the poll. Okay. So a variety of responses here, and in fact, the correct answer is the one that the majority had, which is both sides of the leaves. Now, that's important because, well, two things. One, with the downy mildew, remember, the sporulation looks different. It's darker, and it's only going to be on the underside. But with powdery mildew, you have to look at both. And in fact, it can be denser on the underside. Here's a nice picture that we had from Paul McKenzie, a sample from a while back, and you could see how much powdery mildew you have there on the underside of that leaf. And that's going to be important for when it comes to control. I'll mention in a moment. Also, I want to mention on the photo on the right, that was one I took in Mexico. I think this was a cantaloupe, and you can see that it had both downy mildew, which are the large irregular dead spots, splotches on there, and powdery mildew, so the white patches. So you can have both on the same plant. So what are we going to do about powdery mildew? Well, this is a true fungus. The name has changed over the years. Appears that the current correct or accepted name is Potosphaera fusca, but you may have seen it as Potosphaera xanthii or under some other names that are out there. That's going to be the predominant species that we're going to have to deal with. It is, again, worse on the squash and pumpkin than on the other cucurbits. It's a foliar and a stem pathogen. like the downy mildew, it's spread by airborne spores, but unlike downy mildew, it doesn't have to have that free water. High relative humidity is going to be enough to allow the pathogen to, or the spores to germinate and infect. So we certainly have plenty of high relative humidities here in North Carolina in the summer, and this, of course, disease can become a big problem, and you get, again, a lot of leaf loss from it. So what do we do? Well, one thing would be not to over fertilize. I know that's my tendency to want to do with the cucurbits, is to, or the squash, they really hit them hard with the fertilizer, but that luxuriant growth is going to be one of the things that the powdery mildew is looking for as well. Again, take a look for the availability of resistant varieties to be able to get that genetic advantage from the start. Then, as far as fungicides here, I'm not going to go, well, actually, I will go into a little bit here. There are more options for fungicides against powdery mildews than the downy mildews, but they each have their disadvantages. Now we'll be sharing with you a link to some Clemson publications that go into detail about management of cucurbit diseases. They mention using either sulfur or chlorothalonil or horticultural oil with baking soda mixed in. So the chlorothalonil, for example, that will do a really good job where the leaves, the top surface of the leaves are hit by the application. Since it's not systemic, it's just going to be a protectant there, and you could still have the fungus developing on the underside of the leaves. With horticultural oil, of course, if that application is made within a time frame too close to sulfur, or on days that the temperature is too high, you can get burn. They don't mention neem oil, but there are neem oil formulations that are registered for use against powdery mildew. The disadvantage there is that it's toxic to bees, so you want to make sure you're applying when they're not out foraging. So I know that's a limitation there. Myclobutanil, that's not mentioned in the Clemson publication, but it is listed in the table of homeowner fungicides that Ingham Meadows program put on, and that'll be in a link too that we'll send. Myclobutanil, that is a conventional, it's called a DMI fungicide. It would, though, have the possible disadvantage of the fungus having developed resistance to it, since there have been cases of that reported. So there are a lot of things that are labeled, but not all of them, well, excuse me, they're going to have some disadvantage one way or another. The one thing I would say is that even though they are labeled, you may find some copper products labeled. I would not try to use copper to control powdery mildew. I just am skeptical that it's going to be effective at all. And the final disadvantage, of course, is because the fungus does reproduce so well, it's going to be a fairly short interval of application, of course, follows the label in all cases. Third disease that I want to mention is anthracnose. This is another true fungus called Calotropicum orbiculare, and it's going to be mainly on the cucumber melons and watermelon. Although I'm going to show you in the next slide some pictures on squash, but particularly on the fruit. So this one can get on the foliage, petioles, the vines, and the fruit. The leaf spots are going to be different. So if you notice in the photo here in the lower left, the lesions are more rounded than you had with the angular lesions with downy mildew. And if you were able to look closely with a hand lens, you would, if the spores are being produced, you would see the small spore masses there and little whiskers, little dark whiskers called setae coming up through there. So that if it's actually producing those, you can identify that with use of a hand lens. Here, the spores are not going to be, since they're sticky, they're not going to be airborne, but they will water splash from one leaf to another. The photo on the right there shows a lesion, an anthracnose lesion on the stem of watermelon. And of course, that's going to be a real problem for that small plant there having that lesion. Now, one other thing to mention, that sometimes these spots on the leaves of cucumber, when it's anthracnose, they're going to be kind of water soaked at first. So you might mistake that for a bacteria. There are bacterial leaf spot diseases as well. Here are a couple of examples of anthracnose on fruit of a couple kinds of squash. So you can see it can do a pretty serious number on them, and you do see the dark areas in the middle there of some of those spots on the left where the fungus is sporulating. The butternut squash there on the right, those lesions are interesting and kind of concentric, so you might mistake that at an early stage for a virus symptom. How do we manage our cucumber anthracnose in the home garden? Since it can be seed-borne, make sure you're planting clean seed or using clean transplants, as the case may be. Unlike the previous two diseases, rotation can be a tool against anthracnose and destroying infected debris in the garden. Again, minimizing leaf wetness, that pretty much goes across the board for fungal and bacterial plant pathogens. Don't work the plants when they're wet, and if you have symptoms, get a diagnosis. Finally, use resistant varieties if you can find them available. Now, why do we get a diagnosis? Let me just do a quick example here. So these were two problems on watermelon that were submitted as part of a sample a number of years ago. On the left and on the right, very similar. Which one would be anthracnose? Well, you really couldn't tell without the use of the microscope. And it turns out that number one was anthracnose and number two was gummy stem blight, another fungal disease, but that we're not going to go into. I just do want to mention, since I did bring up the name of gummy stem blight, that gummosis on the stem of a cucurbit is a non-specific reaction. So you can get that as a reaction to multiple problems, not just gummy stem blight. Gummy stem blight does tend to be more on watermelon too. I'll just throw that out there. All right. Yeah, it's not one that you're likely to encounter in the home garden. We do talk about Phytophthora a lot on plants, pests, and pathogens. I will just mention a couple things here with the cucurbits, that you can have both a stem or crown rot, and you can have fruit rot where the fruit is in, I assume this was the portion that was, no, but not even the portion in contact with the soil, because it looked like that was over here, but you have the fruit infection here. The one thing about management I want to mention here is that, as the name implies, the most common species would be Phytophthora capsicii. That also gets on pepper, it gets on tomato, it gets on eggplant. So when you're planning your rotation, if you have this problem, don't rotate with those particular crops. And I've used this photo in the past to illustrate the point that just because you're seeing leaf spots doesn't mean it's a leaf problem. So these spots are actually a wilting reaction by the cucumber vine, and the problem was down below. Fairly easy to diagnose the root knot nematode on the roots of these these cucumber roots. So again, you're going to have to be concerned about multiple types of plants in the vegetable garden being susceptible to this. Really quickly, then to the viruses. There's no way to do this in a poll the way we have it set up on Zoom, but if you take a minute to think about, well, which one of these might be papaya ring spot virus symptoms, which might be watermelon mosaic virus, and which might be zucchini yellow mosaic virus. And the bottom line is that it requires testing to really be sure what virus you have. The actual answers, though, are the top one there was zucchini yellow mosaic virus on the left, and the watermelon with all the crazy rings, excuse me, papaya ring spot virus, excuse me, and watermelon mosaic virus on the yellow squash there on the bottom. All of these, well, first of all of these belong to the same group. They're called the potaviruses, named after potato virus Y. They are transmitted by aphids. It seems that the zucchini yellow mosaic virus, from what I understand, is going to be the more common one here in North Carolina, but the other two are not impossible. So you can have leaf mosaic, as you see there in the lower picture, as well as these fruit symptoms that can be rather strange. And I think that's what happened with that pumpkin that was on display there at the state fair last fall, that it was actually a virus infected pumpkin. And that's why it had the green kind of patches on it that made it look like it had crossed with the watermelon that it was growing next to. In faded out text here, I've mentioned cucumber mosaic virus, which is also aphid transmitted, because the reason I put that faded out is that we don't see it all that much. Now we had the last we saw cucumber mosaic virus was in 2021, and that was on tomato and rain lily as a white host range. We haven't seen CMV on a cucurbit crop since 2004 here in the clinic. That's one time this century. And we have seen zero squash mosaic virus in the clinic this century. So that's why they put that in even more faded out text there. But you've probably heard of them. Just kind of be aware that the main ones here in North Carolina at this time are the POTI viruses on our cucurbits. Just worth mentioning a couple others that are will grab your attention if you do happen to see them in the garden. There's a fungus called Coenifera that will get on the flowers and the young fruits of squashes and pumpkins, and it will cause a real wet decay of those tissues. At first, it might look kind of like powdery mildew with a white fuzziness, but then it quickly has these black heads that develop on it, and you can recognize that as Coenifera. Fasciation, I couldn't find my pictures of the squash vines with this, so I put in the picture of the beans, but just those fused stems there that look like a ribbon, that can happen. Slime molds, which of course don't do any harm to the plant, but just happen to find the plant to crawl up on and spoilate. You may see those on your cucurbits from time to time, like this Physarum on this cucumber leaf. And finally, poor pollination. So this, for example, with cucumber happens in hot weather. I'll have to leave it to Matt to say if it's because the bees are feeling lethargic and they're not visiting so much, or what exactly is going on. I also read that this can be a knock-on effect of plants that have got downy mildew, so they may have poor pollination, and you get the misshapen fruits, and the case here of the cucumber as an example. With that, I will turn it over to Matt.
Well, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. All right. Let's start with, let's continue actually with some arthropods of cucurbits. So there are many types of, just like there are many diseases that get on cucurbits, there are numerous arthropods, insects and mites that are adapted to feed on cucurbits. Some are generalists, whereas some are specialists. And feed variously on different types and varieties, as Mike mentioned too. It's similar with the arthropods. Some are direct pests, others are more important in transmitting diseases, and of course they're pollinators too. And actually, there was a recent paper that just came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and you can see this bee here, these cucurbit bees that are specific to cucurbit flowers. They pollinate cucurbits, and actually the study just found that cucurbits are native really to the southwestern US and in Mexico, and as humans move them throughout the country and the continent, basically the bees develop different populations, and so they're fairly distinct. And the ones in the East Coast had rapidly evolved because of so much planting of these squash and other cucurbits upon which they feed and pollinate. So we have actually shaped some species due to our love of cucurbits. So there's going to be some links sent out by Charlotte and Caroline later. This is a very quick thing. I'm not going to linger on this, but just kind of a table of the different pests of cucurbits, and some are more common, some are more sporadic. But I'm going to mention most of these pests today. So let's start with the true bugs. So the true bugs, of course, are the insects with sucking mouth parts. They don't chew on things. They suck juices out of the plants. And there are several pests that are true bugs of cucurbits. The most important probably is the squash bug. There are actually a couple species in the genus Anassa. And these are actually a type of leaf-footed bug, although they don't have the expanded leaf-like legs that the typical leaf-footed bugs you see. They're also kind of related to stink bugs and such. So kind of stink bug-like insect on squash specific to cucurbits. The adults are about 1/2 inch long, dark brown, with these darker flecks and kind of an orangish brown border around the body. Again, they don't have those leaf-like legs like a typical leaf-footed bug. They can cause significant damage. I'll show you that in a few minutes, in a second, I mean. And they feed on the leaves and fruit of most cucurbits, particularly pumpkins, squashes, and melons. And the feeding can cause necrosis, and they have been implicated in the transmission of cucurbit yellow vine disease, which is a bacterium. Now, one of the things to look for early on are the eggs and nymphs of these squash bugs. This is actually a time when you can probably control them the best, especially in a smaller or smallish garden. Search the undersides of leaves for these loose batches of orangish gold eggs. They're football shaped kind of. That's a very distinct for squash bugs. These can be scraped off, or the entire leaf can be ripped off and destroyed. That'll take those out of the population. Same with the nymphs. If you start to see nymphs develop, they're going to be a grayish pale color with lots of black granules all over them. These then also can be kind of hand-picked off or kind of smacked into some soapy water from the leaves, or again, the leaves can be removed and destroyed completely, and that'll help take them out of the population. Now, these do have one generation per year. They prefer squash, pumpkin, cucumber, and melon in that order, whereas butternut, royal acorn, and others are more resistant, things with harder rind. Adults overwinter in debris and leaf litter, so removing the substrate can help reduce the incidence. Like I said, hand removing the eggs and nymphs can help reduce the numbers. You can also place cover like cardboard or tiles or something near the plants, and what they do is the adults may hide under there, and you can lift those up and destroy any of the adults that are around near the garden. So these are some cultural control methods. There are chemical controls, but I'm not going to discuss those right now. But they are sporadic pests of squash, especially in the home garden. Now, another little bug that you might see very commonly are the flea hoppers. These are small plant bugs, look like little flea beetles, but they actually have sucking mouth parts and shorter, fewer segments in the antennae. Females have these short wings, and I'll show you males and other females will have longer wings. These are little tiny black bugs with little white specks all over them. And the feeding causes stippling damage. This is actually a soybean, but they're very common on all different plants that cause similar type of damage. And they'll also leave little dark fecal specks all over the plant, which is a little bit different than many of the other bugs around. They will feed on a variety of vegetables and weeds and whatnot and plants around the garden. So usually when you have them, they're all over all different plants. Now, here's a long-winged version. The nymphs are green, and the eggs, which you probably wouldn't be able to see anyway, are going to be very tiny and inserted into the leaf tissue. But these flea hoppers can be common, and there are control methods you can find online. But they're not going to be a severe pest typically. They may cause, it really depends on their density that you're finding out there. Now, whiteflies are a more sporadic pest, but they can cause some issues to cucurbits. Mostly you're going to see the sweet potato whitefly or the greenhouse whitefly. And they have these little kind of disc-like young, and they develop into these adults that are whiteflies, these white, little tiny white waxy insects. And they, like I said, they're fairly sporadic, but they can sometimes cause silvering of the leaves. Now, I have not seen this myself in any samples that have come through the clinic, but it's a known thing. And this is directly from the feeding in their saliva, not a disease that they transmit. So scouting the undersides of the leaves can help. You can maybe also look for sooty mold and honeydew, which these will produce as well. And shaking the plants can reveal the adults sometimes if they're flying around. Now, of course, related to whiteflies are aphids. They can be fairly similar, kind of in how you find them. These might be producing honeydew. There might be sooty mold on the plants. And aphids directly are not a huge pest. per se, but they can transmit some diseases like viruses, especially. And several species that are common on cucurbits. The most common are the green peach aphid and the cotton melon aphid. The cotton melon aphid being a really prolificous aphid. It feeds on lots of different plants. That's why it's actually called the cotton/melon aphid. You probably heard this on the program before, but they're kind of a little stumpier, darker, typically, although come in yellow forms than the green peach aphid, which comes in pink and green and is usually more spindly looking. Aphids are the most common vectors of viruses of plants, and they can transmit various viruses to cucurbits, as Mike mentioned, for example, watermelon mosaic virus and cucumber mosaic virus. And you treat as you would other aphids on other plants. Okay, so there are some beetle pests of cucurbits. These are chewing insects with hard wing coverings, of course. The most common are going to be the cucumber beetles in general. So there are two main leaf beetles called cucumber beetles. There's the striped cucumber beetle, Acalyma vittata, and the spotted cucumber beetle, Diabrotica undecipunctata, which the spotted cucumber beetle looks like a green ladybug, but is not related to ladybugs, only distantly. Larvae live in soil. You typically don't see them, although they may bore into the rinds if the fruits are laying on the ground, or in the stems and roots, but very, very rarely, especially not the spotted cucumber beetle, which actually the larvae are called corn rootworms. So they're much more important on things like corn and some other crops. But the adults are the most damaging stages. They feed on the plant tissue and gouge out sections of the plants, from the stems, the leaves to the fruit. They can also transmit bacterial wilt pathogen, Erwinia tracheophylla, and squash mosaic virus, both through their kind of saliva and kind of regurgitating fluids, but also through their feces, which they are produced abundantly on the plants when they're feeding. Here's just some damage and some kind of shots. These are horror shots, I guess they might look like. The larvae, this is why corn rootworms are called that, even though they grow up to be the spotted cucumber beetle. But these are striped cucumber beetle larvae, which look very similar and look a lot like a worm. But you can see the scarring on the surface of fruits, but they'll also do this on the stems and chew some holes in the leaves as well. Now, another beetle found on squashes, or at least cucurbits, is the squash beetle. Now, this is Epilacna borealis. It is actually a ladybug, one of only a few species that feed on plants in the U.S. One of the other major ones is the Mexican bean beetle. Again, that feeds, of course, on legumes, typically, soybeans and other beans that are related to that. But the squash beetle is a relative of that. They are large or roundish orange beetles, look like a ladybug with the black spots, short antennae like a ladybug, because again, it is a ladybug. But the larvae are a little bit different than other ladybugs in that they are yellowish and caterpillar-like, and they have these very large spiny protuberances all over the body. Very distinct for this pest. If you see that larva on a squash or cucurbit, it's a squash beetle. The larvae and adults feed on the foliage and often skeletonizing it. And the adults will actually, you can see here, will chew a ring around the area where they often chew. And we've actually seen some pictures in the past through this program where it looks like they may have even fed on the fruit, at least creating circles, chewing circle marks in the fruit. I'd have to find that later on, but it's pretty interesting symptoms. The adults overwinter in debris like the squash bugs. So again, removing debris can help reduce the hibernation sites for these beetles that may attack the plants the next year. Okay, there are also a few cucurbit pests that are caterpillars. These will grow up into moths. And one of the most important ones, if not the most important cucurbit pest, is the squash vine borer. Melidia cucurbitaceae. These are actually very beautiful day-flying moths. They're metallic blue and orange, very attractive moths, but of course they are going to lead to these horrific little larvae or sometimes big larvae. The adults are active in late spring and early summer, and they mate, and the females lay eggs singly on the plants, typically near the base. Larvae hatch and bore into the stem and the base where they can cause a lot of damage. They feed inside and can cause wilting and death, can be found by the abundant wet sawdust-like frass that comes out of these holes in the base of the plant. The larvae then leave the plant to pupate in the soil. There are 2 generations in North Carolina, and they overwinter as pupae. So yeah. Now just some more pictures. So here's a very large larva, that one of many that were found in the base of a plant. You can see the little crochets, these little hooks on the prolegs. That tells you it's a caterpillar, not a maggot or some kind of other, beetle pest, which we don't really have any borers of cucurbits that are beetles. But I did see some misidentified pictures online of maggots inside the stem. Those maggots can be secondary to the squash vine borers, but the squash vine borers have these little crochets, this dark head capsule, and these 6 true legs on the thorax. Now, the larvae born of the stem, like I said, it creates this kind of sawdust-like frass. It kind of makes the stem really gross too. They'll even feed into the fruit. The eggs are very tiny, as you can see here, and again, laid singly, typically near the bases of the plants, so you can scout for them as well. But again, when they feed in the base of the plants, they cause the plant not to be able to take up water and nutrients, things like that, and they begin to wilt and die. So look at the base of these plants for the frass and the signs of the caterpillars. But as far as management, so you could till the soil in late winter to expose the overwintering pupae, rotate squash to another location each season. You can destroy the vines that have been killed to break the life cycle. So definitely destroy those if they've been infested. There is talk about, I've never done this. I've never had it, luckily, the issue, and we don't grow a lot of squash in our garden, but you can apparently maybe slit open the stem where they are and kind of kill the larvae that are in there, either by removing them or using a needle or something to kind of blend them up, as gross as that sounds. And then kind of bury the base of the stem in the soil to help it kind of heal. But I really don't have any personal experience with that, so I'm not sure if that actually works. Plant as early as the weather allows, because they don't emerge until the early summer. And it rarely attacks cucumbers and melons, but prefers squash and gourds. And my neighbor actually grew this, the Tromboncino. He just said it was an Italian squash. It's actually a relative, it's a cultivar of the machata, the butternut squash that Mike mentioned, which are resistant to squash vine borers because the stems are so dense. Now, moving on to some other moths, the pickleworms and melonworms being less common in North Carolina, but these are crambid moths in the genus Diaphania. The overwinter, actually like the downy mildews that Mike mentioned, they are not a type of organism that can survive here in North Carolina over the winter. So these develop and breed in Florida and Texas all throughout the year. And then as it warms up more north to those areas, these start to spread up north. So really, North Carolina doesn't typically get them until about July. They have about a month-long life cycle, and it will have overlapping generations, so about 2 or 3 here in North Carolina. The females call males with these pheromones from a hairbrush. Summer squash's most preferred preference of other cucurbits varies. So, for instance, watermelon is not preferred. Now, the larvae produce copious amounts of frass and feed in the flowers first, and then may bore into the young developing fruit, as well as feed on the leaves a little bit. And as they get older, they will bore right into the fruit and leave holes and frass, which then nobody wants to eat that fruit. The fruit that are too hard, like cantaloupe, may have surface feeding. So they'll just feed, gouge away the surface. And to identify these, the young larvae have these distinct dark spots. And as they get older, they're kind of this plain greenish yellow larva crawling around these are in the flowers of a cucurbit. Now, to manage them, control before August is not usually necessary. Covering plants at night with screen or mesh during late summer or early fall may prevent moths from laying eggs. Preventive sprays or drenches can be made using improved chemistries for the homeowner use. Applications can be made at night to reduce bee exposure, but this is also a thing to consider when asking about chemicals, is to look at the toxicity to bees and to make sure that you're not killing the pollinators of these plants, because the fruit won't set if you kill the pollinators. So be very careful about chemical control. Once larvae enter the fruit, though, the control is not possible. So preventing that from happening is the best bet. Now, I mentioned a lot about pickleworm, but melonworm is fairly uncommon in North Carolina, but it does exist. It's got a similar looking moth, but with much more white on the wings. And the larvae have these have these stripes down the back, a pair of stripes down the back of cream color over the green, which differs from the pickleworm. Finally, a couple other pests of cucurbits. Thrips can be pests of cucurbits, so they're not super common out in the home garden. Often in the greenhouse or out in the field, we may see these. These are tiny yellow elongate insects. The adults and larvae feed on cell tissue, the tissue and cells contents, so they'll be filled with green. And what happens then is they suck the green out of the plant, and that causes these white or silvery patches. And they're also very, very messy, where they defecate green or black fecal spots all over where they're feeding as well. And finally, spider mites. Again, both thrips and spider mites are common to a lot of different plants. The spider mites are tiny arachnids, usually found in large numbers and with associated silk and round eggs. So look under the leaves with hand lenses. They cause this stippling damage. This is a cucurbit that was affected by spider mites. And you can see the dull look and all this kind of diffuse little spots of yellow everywhere. This makes them look bad, and obviously the plants suffer a bit. Oils and soaps can help reduce the numbers, but be careful about how and when to apply. Some insecticides will cause outbreaks of spider mites too. So that's another concern about spraying some pesticides, especially pyrethroids, can kill their natural enemies and or just cause the spider mite populations to explode. So that's all I have for the cucurbit pests. And I guess now I will move into our bolos, and feel free to type some questions in the chat, and we'll try and answer them. But let's move into some bolos and be on the lookouts. So not just about cucurbits. There are going to be lots of different things out and about soon, lots of different critters, and Mike will continue with the disease bolos after this. But things to look out for in late April, early May, until our next session are going to be things like May beetles. So these Phylophaga species, they kind of look like little nuts. They're brown. Some are hairy, some are not. But they're often attracted to lights, and these are white grubs that were in the soil. They're typically not doing damage, but they're more often a nuisance than anything, the adults, when they come to lights and get into homes. But you may start seeing them flying around your lights at night, and reducing the amount of light can help reduce the numbers that you have. So also take a look out for young bagworms. They're going to be starting to kind of hatch as the temperature gets warmer into May. And if you have plants that are infested by bagworms previously, scout for these. Smack some branches on some paper, or look around for these little tiny bagworms. You can see this is arborvitae, so it's got these little, you can see how tiny these bagworms are compared to the needles on those plants. So take a look, scout those plants that might have previous infestations. Lots of bugs and caterpillars are going to be active. We're going to start seeing lots of leaf hoppers. In fact, we got some leaf hoppers damaging rose photos in recently. Lots of other pests are going to be out and about. Lots of caterpillars are hatching and feeding on plants. Speaking of roses, the sawflies are going to start hatching and feeding on your roses if they haven't already done so. So you may start to see little windows in the rose leaves, and then later on larger patches of the rose leaves fed on. Flip over the leaves, look for these little tiny caterpillars, which are almost certainly going to be a type of sawfly, not a caterpillar. You're going to start to see galls developing on a lot of plants. So witch hazel will have the aphid galls, and a lot of the oaks, you'll start to see the developing gall wasp galls as well. There are going to be, of course, blood-feeding arthropods present now. They're present most of the year, but they're going to be much more abundant now that it's warmer out. So mosquitoes and ticks, be on the lookout for them. Be careful. Wear DEET for mosquito control, and help protect against ticks by applying permethrin to clothing properly. And that will kill ticks and chiggers and things like that crawl up into shoes and clothing. And of course, there's going to be lots and lots of other critters out there. Moths, big moths, flies, lots of other critters. So just be on the lookout and let us know if you see anything you don't know, and we'll help you identify it.
Thank you so much, Matt. And Mike, we'll let you get lined up to share your bolos for this month.
Suppose it would help if I would unmute.
There you go. Thank you.
All right. For late April to late May, just a few quick bolos to talk about.
Mike, we can't hear you. Try again and make sure you're not on mute.
Yeah, I was.
Okay,
I
there you are.
also stopped talking, but you wouldn't
Okay, I'm
know the
sorry.
difference at your end. Yeah, sorry about that. Just a few real quick disease bolos for this period of the month that we have between programs. I have seen some symptoms actually for a while now of rose rosette. That first growth coming up and being a little bit too elongate, and the leaves, instead of going from the juvenile red color to a green, they stay that reddish tint. So that's your first sign that you have rose rosette, and the shrub should be removed at that first sign, because there is no way to cure that. Even if you were to cut that cane out all the way to the base, there's a good chance that you will not get the virus out, and it will be systemic within the plant, and you will eventually have a monster on your hands, as far as not dangerous to you, but just a very ugly looking rose as that disease progresses, plus the risk of spreading it to others. We talked about powdery mildew and the cucurbits, but we'll also be seeing it on a lot of other landscape plants coming up. So for example, rose, and really hard on our euonymus and our crepe myrtles. The question then comes up, when is some kind of treatment needed? We talked a little bit about fungicides for powdery mildew and the cucurbits, but I just want to mention one point, which is the decision to treat or not to treat. There are cases where it's not worth it because it's really not doing much damage. So, or that it's hard to read. So it would be, the application would be difficult. For example, on our landscape trees, on oaks. Now there's one to kind of I should have put this pictures of this. A special be on the lookout will be for powdery mildew on Japanese maples. We saw it on a homeowner Japanese maple last fall, and that was the first report of that particular fungus. It's called Sawadia polyphyta, I think it was. So even though that particular group of maples has not traditionally been something we've looked for powdery mildew on, it would be good to keep an eye on that. And being small, I'm not sure where the calculus is going to fall as to whether those are going to be something worth treating or not. Fungicides may be needed on some of our ornamentals for powdery mildew, things like rose, things like phlox, crepe myrtle. I know last year at home I was doing that, zinnia perhaps, and a greenhouse and nursery. They're going to have it, you know, less of a tolerance probably for imperfections, for diseases and pests. So they're going to be applying in some cases where we might not, like in dogwoods. Although if your dogwood is small enough and you've got powdery mildew, that would be an option. And there are other cases where it's just futile. So why try to protect, for example, your euonymus from powdery mildew? If it's got a lot of it, then consider a different kind of shrub. A third category, we've talked about Exhibicidium on different hosts. We talk about it every spring as something to look out for on your camellias. But a little bit later is the time period for the Exhibicidium leaf gall on azalea. And those, they can even be hollowed out. So that kind of a bubble there that forms on the leaf. It's not a real destructive problem. Again, really it's cosmetic, but you may get some questions about that in the next month. So be on the lookout. Roses, black spot and cercospora leaf spot. Anybody want to venture which one this is? Nope. Notice that the edges of the spots are fairly smooth and the color isn't all that black. It's kind of a browner center. So if you had a more uniform color, I would say, but definitely if you had the fimbriate, the feathery margin on the spot, then that's black spot. Both of them cause, of course, dark spots, and both of them can cause the chlorosis, the yellowing, as well as leaf drop. For some orange things to look out for in May on our different fruits, we occasionally will get questions about a slimy orange sap coming out of muscadine vines as the sap rises. And this is just a, well, it's a bleeding from cuts. It eventually stops and the mass dries up. It's more of concern if it's in the main trunk that indicates a crack from cold damage or some other kind of injury.
Pending lawsuit from
this is just the presence of yeast or bacteria or things like that on that, colonizing that sap. So it doesn't represent a disease per se. Our blackberries get a couple different kinds of rusts, the cane and leaf rust, which is a little drier and yellowier looking, and then the orange rust, which is kind of a waxier looking orange growth on the very young foliage because it is systemic. So that's the more serious of the two because it is systemic in the vine and can become systemic. And of course, cedar apple rust, the spermaceal stage, the fungus did its thing on the junipers. The spores that were lucky enough found their way to an apple or a crab apple somewhere, and you'll start seeing the bright yellow to orange spots developing on the apple leaves with the spermaceal state. And then next month, perhaps we'll mention a bolo of looking for the estial stage on the underside of those leaves. To round out then with the vegetables, herbicide injury. Okay, everybody, myself included, wants to grab the herbicide sprayer and get to work, but we often get collateral damage on our vegetables and other ornamentals, so be on the lookout for that. Classic glyphosate damage on tomato here, the very bright yellow to almost white sometimes discoloration of the bases of the leaflets on the tomato. Over fertilization, under fertilization, of course, problems at this time of year. Watch out for bacterial leaf spot on your transplants when you're getting the peppers and the tomatoes there. You may see even early blight on tomato, and out in the garden, tomato spotted wilt virus is a possibility on tomato. That's a picture here in the lower left, that one being thrips transmitted from weeds around the garden. If you haven't had enough bolos, go to our website, and on the menu tab or the menu bar on the left, you'll see that item, and it will take you to a month-by-month list of be on the lookouts. So back to you,
Excellent.
Charlotte.
All right, it'll actually be me taking it on from here. Thank you so much, Matt and Mike, for that presentation. I'm really glad we decided to do cucurbits. Certainly timely and important, and a number of calls will be coming in, as we know, for those issues. I also want to thank you for helping us compile. We have a great list of resources, both NC State, and I'm going to tell you about some Clemson resources. So look for the follow-up email on that. And also, these are all compiled on the EMG intranet on the Plants, Pests, and Pathogens page, along with the recording. So you can look back at previous issues and quickly find those resources. And I hope that helps you. All right, let's get going. And before I, let's see, I need to be sharing my right screen. Hold on just a second for me. Goofed a little bit there. Okay, sounds good. So as we move from the Beyond the Lookouts, I do want to take a minute just to celebrate Matt, because if you might have seen, our state magazine has written a wonderful article featuring Matt Bertone and his work in the PDIC, and it's called The Bugman of Raleigh. So it's a wonderful article. While I'm talking about our resource spotlight, Charlotte's going to put that link in the chat. The whole issue, not the whole issue, but a good part of the issue of the magazine this month is featuring extension, the work of extension across the state. So there's this great article on that. There's also an article on the Durham Master Gardener project at Cocoa Cinnamon. That's the container garden project that was featured in the Learn, Grow, Share webinar. And in particular, it features Deborah Pilkington, our Master Gardener volunteer from Durham, who is in charge of that project, along with Peter Gilmer. So check out the magazine. It's a great article and really, really fun. So congratulations, Matt, on that.
Thank you so much. I'm honored.
He's even more famous than he was before now. He's our Bugman of Raleigh, first and foremost, of course. So moving on to the resource spotlight, this is where I try to feature something for you each month that will be helpful for you in your work, or also to share with the public. And so keeping with the cucurbit theme, I want to tell you about two resources that are offered by Clemson Cooperative Extension Home and Garden Information Center. So we here at NC State have a number of great resources, but we also look out for those in the extension family. And sometimes another university has got a different way of expressing the information, and we really like these two particular resources from Clemson. So the first one I want to show you is relating to the pests of the cucurbit family. And so here you can see that document, or that link, on my screen. And what I like about this is it goes through some of the big hitters that Matt talked about today, with several good pictures. There are brief profiles on each insect or pest, with just enough description as well as a good picture, and then even a little bit of control information right there for you. So we find this document to be quite helpful and good to share with the public. As you scroll down through all of these profiles, you get to a number of tables that I want to share with you. So I'm just going to scroll down till I get to the first table. All right, table 1 is relating to the control. So we all are going to have these questions about controlling these insects. And what I like about this table is it gives you both what they're calling contact pesticides, which are the conventional pesticides that we're familiar with, as well as right alongside some natural or less toxic options. So depending upon the pest that you're targeting, you've got those options right there, the traditional contact pesticide. Now it's giving you the active ingredient or the chemical name. And so that's where table number 2 comes in. As you scroll down here, Now, if you've determined what pest you are targeting and you've determined your plan of attack, say you want to go with an insecticidal soap, or you want to go with one of the active ingredients that we spoke about earlier, that might be a more traditional contact insecticide. This is going to translate for you the name of the active ingredient into brand names that you might find, or the public would more easily be able to identify with the brand name. So we found this a good publication for your help, for your reference, and for the public. What I like about it also is it mentions down here at the bottom something that's important to all of us. And that is, you know, by Clemson mentioning these brand names, it does not give any intent of endorsement of a particular product, or it's not intentionally excluding a mention of a particular product. And that's important for us in our work. The other thing is to keep in mind that this list of products was recommended for use in South Carolina, because Clemson is in South Carolina, and that at the time of publication, these pesticides were considered legal. So it's important to recognize that where the resource is being written for, South Carolina being close enough to us to be very applicable, but also to know that, you know, we've got the state and federal agencies that are regulating these pesticides, and that some of those things can change. So kind of that, it's not a waiver, I'm looking for the right word, a disclaimer, so to speak. The parallel publication relates to the cucurbit diseases. So here it is set up very similarly, with your diseases each having a short profile with a good picture and a little bit of prevention or control information. As we get down to the tables in this document, forgive my scrolling, here in table 1, we were having a little conversation about are there any disease-resistant varieties of cucumbers, for example. So here's a little bit of information on some disease-resistant varieties. Now again, these are targeted or intended for South Carolina. So we want to always consider where the source is coming from, but these may be close enough to us in North Carolina to be useful. So here they're listing a couple of resistant cucumbers, slicing cucumbers and pickling cucumbers, resistant to the different mildews that Mike spoke about. So that's in table 1. And then as we get down here, again, same kind of setup where you've got the particular vegetable that you're looking at. You might have identified the disease thanks to those profiles up above. Here is the potential fungicide that you might use. And as you get down to the bottom, you've got that translation, so to speak, from where am I going to find this in what kind of a brand name product. So I hope you find that those are helpful to you, and they'll be included in all of the rest of our links. And now it's my opportunity to tell you a few things that are coming up in the next month or so. Last month, you might remember I asked you to participate in a survey just to let us know what you might be interested in, if you would be interested in doing some of the travel study adventures that Extension Gardener offers. And since participating in that survey, we did receive some interest, and a trip has been scheduled for this coming September to Vancouver and Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. So those dates are confirmed, September 11th through 17th, and registration information is coming soon. I listed just some of the places that are on the itinerary for that trip. So that should be wonderful. And then also, they have made decisions about what to include in 2024. So Costa Rica will be in February, going to the Netherlands to see the tulips in April. And then, as I might have said last time, in May, this will be a domestic trip that will be a bus tour visiting horticultural destinations kind of up the East Coast from that, in that area of Pennsylvania and Delaware, DC and Virginia, where there's just so much to see. So keep an eye on this website, and maybe you can join us in September in British Columbia. We have a continuing education webinar that we've just scheduled coming up in early June. We're going to have Basil Camus, who is a tree ecologist from Leaf and Limb. Leaf and Limb is a local tree care company here in Raleigh, and they're doing a lot of environmental education to their clients and the greater community. This presentation that Basil will give us is on 8 ways that gardeners can help heal the earth. So this is going to focus on some of those simple ways that we can make an impact in our gardens and share those ways with others, whether that's from tree selection, or proper mulching, proper planting and pruning. So I hope you can join us for that. It'll be in the afternoon, thinking that perhaps you'll be out in your garden in the morning in June and then come inside for this webinar. You can sign up now on the intranet. Okay, in the area of our garden and landscape course series, George Place has got a new course that is starting May 15th. Wanted to just make you aware of that. This is going to be on pest management, ID, and troubleshooting insects, diseases, and disorders. So that's going to be about a month long. Take a look at that if you have interest, starting in May. On another save the date, this is looking ahead to the fall, but this is a popular and annual event. This is the Western North Carolina Gardening Symposium. And this is out in Flat Rock, North Carolina, and it is a one-day symposium that's put together by 5 different counties, Master Gardener programs in 5 different counties. So they've got the date, and registration for that will begin in August. So it's Buncombe County's Master Gardener website that you're going to want to keep an eye on for registration information. And I'll try to also mention it in other plants, pests, and pathogens as we get closer. That brings us to the conclusion for today, but we also get to preview what's coming up next month. So next month, May 23rd, will be our plants, pests, and pathogens date. And we're going to have a presentation from Colleen Doherty, who is an associate professor here at NC State's Department of Molecular and Structural Biochemistry. She studies plants' circadian rhythms, plants' ability to tell time. Fascinating work that she's doing. And she's going to give us a presentation on, in particular, how our warming night temperatures with climate change are affecting plant stress. That's one that in turn is affecting their circadian rhythms, or their sense of time. So that should be a fascinating lecture. I hope you can join us then. And that brings us to the end of our program for today. Take one more look at the chat to see if there's anything else that we can help you with. But we thank you for joining us. I hope your day is lovely where you are. It's turning out beautiful here. And again, thanks to Mike and Matt for a great presentation. And congratulations to Matt for coming in on the chat.
Have a good
Thanks,
month,
Tim.
everyone.
Yeah, thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you.
Enjoy the warm weather.